Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Cryptozoology. For those of you who might be considered fans of cryptozoology in the sense that you have prolonged exposure to the media that surrounds cryptozoology, perhaps for extended periods of time, you are likely familiar with the hit documentary series Monster Quest. And if any of you are fans of Monster Quest particularly, you are likely to have heard at least once the term Hogzilla. In fact, it is even likely that more of you who did not watch Monster Quest when you were younger or at any point in your life have been exposed to this term recently due to its use in a new article stemming from a sighting in China. For those who have never heard the term, Hogzilla is something of an umbrella term. Generally speaking, it is used to refer to any sightings, descriptions, findings of, to put it simply, oversized wild hogs. However, the understanding of Hogzilla as this umbrella term makes it difficult to discern what exactly Hogzilla is supposed to be. Why is it included in cryptozoology so often? Is Hogzilla supposed to be a new species? If not, what exactly is it? This will be the discussion point of this video because I think it's important to understand not only the term thoroughly, but because you may have a better understanding of it, it's quite possible you'll be able to appreciate the research that went into figuring out what Hogzilla was. As far back as can be traced, the term Hogzilla is first used around March 19th, 2005. The term was used to refer to a large, allegedly wild hog shot in the state of Georgia in the United States in June of 2004 by a hunter named Chris Griffin. Chris Griffin claimed he had shot the hog in the wild, that it was 12 feet long, and weighed likely over 1,000 pounds. If anything was to be called a monster due to its size, it was certainly this first Hogzilla. But this first Hogzilla also wasn't the last one. Two other prime examples of Hogzilla include a large hog shot in the Lost Creek Plantation, which is a commercial hunting preserve outside of Anniston, Alabama, shot particularly by, at the time, 11-year-old Jameson Stone. Hogzilla shot by Oren Don Malloy in Plaska, Texas in 2002. It's important to note that while this was one of the first examples of giant hogs being shot, it was not the first one to be called Hogzilla. In fact, it did not start being called Hogzilla until after the 2005 shooting. It is one of the only examples of a Hogzilla that actually predates the use of the word Hogzilla. Of course, studying these cases can't be so ground level. To understand what Hogzillas are, one has to go deeper. It's important to note that Chris Griffin really stuck to his guns on his story as an eyewitness and as an alleged shooter of what he believed to be either a new variant of an already existing species or a new species. In fact, he lost his job over the publicity around Hogzilla. It would be many years before the Griffin Hogzilla would be examined. The body at that point had actually been buried, and in many ways, along with the body, the story had been buried. When more Hogzilla bodies, like the Malloy Hogzilla and the Stone Hogzilla, started popping up, Griffin wanted this carcass examined professionally. It was dug back up and scheduled to be examined. Even though Griffin's reasoning was mainly to get fame and headlines from this animal, this would be the beginning of a very important scientific study. Subsequent studies were also carried out on the Stone Hogzilla and the Malloy Hogzilla. The Stone Hogzilla was, unfortunately, deemed too controversial. There were inconsistencies in the Stone's eyewitness stories, and once publications decided to stop publishing such controversy, it was decided that results wouldn't really be gaining much traction. The Malloy Hogzilla, however, would prove to be the most interesting. Of course, going into the examinations of the Griffin and Malloy Hogzillas, there are many questions. The main ones, of course, pertaining to, well, what kind of animal might we be looking at? There are several theories that attempt to encompass the theory base for the identity of a Hogzilla. Are they prehistoric survivors? Are they a new species? And if they're not either, is it some kind of natural overgrowth that we just don't know about? Is the opposite of island dwarfism taking place here? Even without examinations, there are certain ways that we can gauge which one of these theories is the most likely. Theories about prehistoric pig ancestors are, unfortunately for many fans, the most unlikely. This would rely on species that we essentially know to be extinct, and it would also rely on essentially incorrect anatomy. The Malloy, griffin, and even stone bodies are not prehistoric-looking feral hogs. They are in fact modern-looking. The only strange thing about them is their size. Nothing else. They do not resemble their prehistoric ancestors. Crossing that off of the list, we are forced to ask, is it a new species? This is also unlikely, but it isn't impossible. The mainland United States is often regarded as very explored, and of course, on a grand scale, it is. But it's also still vastly untamed. Even the areas that are cataloged aren't inhabited. These uninhabited areas can hide things as large as bears that people might never see in their lives. Even with an invasive species like wild hogs, there are plenty of areas to hide, even if you're a species that is rather large. If you're small in numbers as well, that would really only aid such a species in their hiding. Of course, the fact that they are these overgrown and otherwise anatomically identical hogs might suggest that they are a new species very similar to the hogs that we know of. However, size does not exceed the possibility of overgrowth. Natural overgrowth is our most likely option, looking at the theories at a face value level. Although it is also unlikely because we would think to see it more often, it certainly isn't impossible that certain genetic mutations are being carried down in species that are not minute enough to constitute a new species, but are enough to create an unusual population within that already existing species. Speculation aside, of course, these examinations were carried out, and they yielded exceedingly interesting results. The griffin Hogzilla turned out to be a hybrid of wild hog and the domestic pig, often called a razorback. Widely unpublicized results of the stone Hogzilla also show it is a razorback. These are essentially domestic pigs. They have simply inherited genes from one side of the family. Razorbacks, although technically a different subspecies, are not their own species, nor are they a new one we did not know about. They are simply the result of certain genetic matchings with the sex of the parents of the individual. This can be seen in animals called ligers, for instance. Ligers are hybrid offspring of male lions and female tigers. This specific sex combination of the parentage actually transfers, or rather, fails to transfer, certain genetic code to this offspring. One of them being the line of code that tells growth hormones when to stop. Ligers keep growing, and as you can see by this image, they get pretty big. The same thing happens in razorbacks. The stone Hogzilla and the griffin Hogzilla are nothing new. The Malloy Hogzilla may be. Examination on the Malloy Hogzilla was carried out by zoologist and biologist Jack Mayer of the Savannah River National Laboratory in Aiken, South Carolina.
This expert can determine if the hog in the picture was pen-raised or a true wild monster.
As far as the presence of any giant pigs left here on the planet, that would include only domestic pigs.
Could this beast be a true wild hog, weighing over 700 pounds? The skull of the animal provides the answers.
This is a wild animal. You can tell by the depth of the dorsal profile. It's a very flat dorsal profile. The bone itself between the sutures is very flat, doesn't look inflated the way it is in a pen-raised animal. The skull itself is fairly narrow. It's not broad the way you would get in a pen-raised animal. If you look at the incisors, the lower incisors, they're very tightly placed together. In an animal that's raised in a pen, these tend to be spread out. As far as whether this animal was raised in a pen or raised in the wild, there's no question in my mind this is a wild animal.
However, the computer calculations tell another part of the story.
In taking the measurements on this skull and comparing it to animals with known weights, it just doesn't come out being 700 pounds.
But Malloy stands by his original estimate.
At that time, we had our scale bottomed out at 300 pounds. We'd have to have them to weigh them, and he bottomed it out both times, 300 pounds. So, you know, you at least got a 600-pound pig, and you kind of got to guess the rest. And just from doing it so much and looking at them, you can kind of get close. And I'm not giving you an official weight, but a pig weighs somewhere around 7 and a quarter.
Mayer remarked that it seemed to him to indeed be a genuinely wild, overgrown hog. This was not a domestic individual, and yet it was absolutely enormous. What this means, we're not entirely sure yet. Most Hogzillas have turned out to be razorback hybrids, and some are even overgrown domestic pigs. There is a small amount of Hogzillas, like the Malloy Hogzilla, however, that appear to push our understanding of how large certain species can get under the conditions they live in. Is the Malloy Hogzilla a new species? Probably not. Is it a prehistoric leftover? No. Is it still an anomaly? Absolutely. And with the more recent reports of wild hogs being deemed Hogzillas that we see in not just North America but also in Asia, we're forced to wonder what the conditions are that are creating this zoological phenomenon, how better we can understand it, and, although it doesn't currently mean it, what it might mean in terms of potentially new species. Hogzilla is a very important case because it really outlines how an examination of a potentially new species should be carried out. There needs to be solid, consistent with itself evidence, solid, consistent, and accurate examinations done by people who know what they're talking about, who know what they're doing, and acceptance of those results if necessary. I'd like to know what you all think of this potentially shining example of scientific practice within the field of cryptozoology, and about how science works in cryptozoology in the first place, or perhaps in tangent with it, as really it should. That being said, until next time.